to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to a new episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Rick Lee, and I'm joined by Lee Johnson. Today we're starting Season 13, a new season and a new bar and other new things as well. During the off-season, Lee and I have been talking about how one of the great things about the podcast is the multiplicity of voices and perspectives we can bring on. We were so happy to have Devanya Havis as our co-host last season, and we are really excited this season to introduce a new co-host, Talia Betcher. Talia Mae Betcher is a professor of philosophy at Cal State University, where she's been doing really groundbreaking work at the intersection of trans philosophy, feminist theory, and the philosophy of self. Her latest book, Beyond Personhood, an essay in trans philosophy, just dropped from Minnesota University Press. This book is already shaking up how we think about identity, embodiment, and what it means to be a person. But Talia's not just an academic powerhouse. She's also a longtime grassroots organizer in the trans community, and she's someone who's never been afraid to ask the hard questions or challenge the status quo. Now, some of you might remember her from an earlier episode we did on trans philosophy. If you listen to that episode, then you know she brings a depth of knowledge, but also she brings the heat to every conversation. So pour yourselves a drink, pull up a chair, and join us in welcoming Talia to the bar. Lee and I have also gotten a little tired of rants and raves, and so we decided today we're going to try something new. So Talia, I'm going to ask you, what are you drinking? And what is your bar stool confession?
Well, first of all, Rick, thank you for that really, really sweet intro.
Oh,
And Rick and Lee, I'm so glad to be here. Glad to be starting this podcast with you. I'm a little bit of a neophyte, but I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be fun. I am going to have a margarita on the rocks, virgin as always.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, confession time. Wow. So you just changed it to confessions as soon as you put the trans person on, is that right?
guilty.
I think what I'll do is I'll start with something really sordid to get everyone really excited. And I've been thinking a lot about this, but I think it's time for me to really, really come out with it. I am philosophically promiscuous.
Ooh.
That is, I am a philosopher slut. Which means that if a philosopher theory idea walks by and it's sexy, I'll philosophize with it. I don't care.
As long as you're safe, Talia, as long as you're safe.
I swing both ways, continental, analytic, and there's a lot of other ways I've tried too. Decolonial feminist philosophy. There's so many things out there, and I just think that it's boring to stick with the same old position and the same old partner.
Nice.
So I think I would strongly recommend this to all philosophers. It's time to put ideology aside, the doctrine aside, and get out there and get philosophucking.
Philosophical polyamory.
Lee, what about you? What's your bar stool confession?
Well, first of all, I want to say welcome, Talia. We're both really excited to have you here, and I'm really excited about the new season that we have lined up. We've got a lot of really great topics and guests lined up for the season, so listeners, stay tuned. I am going to have 2 fingers of Buffalo Trace on a rock to drink, and I have an embarrassing barstool confession to make, and that is that until too late in life, like when I was in graduate school, I truly, truly believed pepperoni was a vegetable.
I'm sorry for laughing.
Now, in my defense, it does have the word pepper right there in it.
True.
And also, it doesn't look like a meat. It doesn't taste like a meat. And just think about this for a second. If you did not know that pepperoni was a meat, why would there ever be any instance in which somebody would tell you it's a meat?
Right.
Like, how would you come to know that it's a meat? So at any rate, I did discover late one night in a drunken argument with some of my grad school colleagues that I was wrong. It is, in fact, a meat. So that's my barstool confession. Rick, what about you?
I'm going to have a Tom Collins. First, I have a mini confession before I get to my main confession, and that is I didn't write Talia the introduction. Lee wrote that. So I accepted your thanks as if I was completely responsible, but I share the sentiments.
You delivered it in such a lovely way, Rick, though. It really meant a lot to me. And thank you, Lee, for writing it. It's beautiful.
We're basically the same person now.
We share one mind in one podcast. So my main confession, and when I say this, so many people are going to say, yeah, me too. But listen to me. I have never read In Search of Lost Time or Remembrance of Things Past by Marcel Proust. But my confession is I'm not going to. I'm sorry, I just can't fit it into my life. There's a lot of good content out there. I just can't invest the commitment it takes to read a tome, well, actually 3 tomes, like this huge oeuvre by Marcel Proust. So I'm not reading it. Sorry, people, especially Michael Noss.
Rick, may I offer you a Madeleine?
Now, that's the funny thing. I know the smell of Madeleines are what gets the character started remembering something. And I think many of us who have been in academia long enough know a lot about what goes on in the story. We could probably talk about it for quite some time without having read it.
That's basically my situation with Harry Potter.
Yeah, don't bother. Let me strongly recommend don't bother.
Yeah. So, Talia, I know we're talking about what is philosophy. How are we going to approach this?
Well, I mean, I think philosophers, we do philosophy all the time, but do we know what we're doing? Do we know what it is? We don't know what we're doing. That's pretty clear. But what is philosophy? Being a big philosophical question, unsurprisingly, it's not an easy one to answer. I mean, if you take philosophy literally, it's going to come from Philos, ancient Greek, friend or lover, Sophia, wisdom or understanding. But that's extremely broad. So if you have someone who's really passionately studying a sacred text, they believe to be filled with wisdom, proverbs, and parables. The question is, does that make them a philosopher? I mean, philosophers typically engage in a sort of argumentation, at least for the most part.
Yeah.
Take a physicist who aims to unlock the mysteries of the universe, and they do engage in reasoning and argumentation. Are they a philosopher? I mean, one of the problems is philosophy is so broad, you can philosophize anything. Characterizing it as just thinking really hard or arguing or reflecting, it just seems way too general to identify anything really distinctive about philosophy as a methodology or set of methodologies. So what is philosophy? What is it to philosophize? And do we even know what we're doing when we do it? That's the question. In general, if I tell someone that I'm doing philosophy, they seem to have 2 really opposing reactions. One is to kind of think that it's bullshit, like it's just a bird thing, like, all right, I have a philosophy too, here's my philosophy. We sit around at a bar, and we get drunk, or we don't get drunk, but we just make shit up, and we talk shit. And so, is that what philosophy is? Is that all that it is? If you read a philosophy text, it's got a lot of big words, a lot of technical jargon, and you might wonder, is this philosophers themselves who have just confused themselves, raised to dust, and then complain that they cannot see? And certainly some philosophers have thought that, right? So Wittgenstein famously thought that philosophers just became hypnotized by language, that they took words out of their proper context of use and then began to wonder, what is justice or what is good? When really what you ought to do is just put the word back where it belongs and use it as normal. And the whole question, what is a so-and-so, is utterly misguided.
I always get a little suspicious, more than a little suspicious, when someone claims that philosophy is just anything. Just a literary genre, just semantics, just
talk on a cereal box.
Yeah, just mental masturbation. Isn't the very resistance to being pinned down part of philosophy's job description in a way? And I wonder if the impulse to dismiss philosophy as bullshit is a symptom of a culture that really has a very low tolerance for uncertainty, or worse, doesn't want to be responsible for thinking. I mean, is it that philosophy is nonsense, or that it insists that we stop outsourcing sense making?
We live in an anti-intellectual culture. And, I was going to say, I think the second attitude that I get, and these are almost simultaneous, is that folks think philosophy is really scary and really hard. So it's both super easy and nonsensical on the one hand, and also really hard and scary and possibly deep on the other. And I find that people have both contradictory attitudes at once. That's definitely part of it, Lee. But I wonder, certainly reputable philosophers have argued that what we take to be philosophy ends up being completely empty, right? It's not just that we think really hard. Lots of people think really hard. Lots of people ask tough questions. Lots of people think outside the box. That doesn't make it philosophy.
Right.
Consider, for example, suppose that, you have a sociologist, a historian, and a philosopher walk into a bar and they're going to be talking about, let's say, sex work.
Right.
You're going to expect something from the sociologist. You're going to expect something from the historian. Now, I can assure you what you would expect from the philosopher is something we might call depth.
Yeah.
You'd expect it to be deep or profound, possibly. And so what is it then we're looking for when we go looking at the philosopher? And is there anything to this profundity, if there is such a thing? And I know that folks have often taken profundity to be a kind of fundamentality. We want to get to the fundamental questions. We want to get to the fundamental truth.
Yeah.
And folks like Richard Rorty, for example, have thought that that's a complete pipe dream, right? That's not really what we're doing or what we can do. And once you see that, it seems like possibly philosophy is out of a job.
My Aunt Connie said to me once a few years ago, Rick, you know what? I think the other day I was philosophing. I said, well, maybe you were. What were you doing? And she said, well, I was waiting in line in the grocery store. And I thought, why does time go so much more slowly when you're waiting in line than, like when you're at a ball game? I said, yeah, Con, you were philosophing. And for me there, two things were really important. The first is the question why. Since Leibniz, this question why has been expanded into the big kahuna. Why is there anything at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? But I think for me, the question why figures in somehow in a central way in philosophy. And the other thing, and this goes back to your issue of depth, philosophy isn't just deep or thinking at the depths, but it's an attempt to get at the depths and bring it to some kind of observation in thought, in language, something that otherwise wouldn't be seen. Philosophy brings it to a certain kind of attention.
The same thing could be said of poetry.
Yeah, true. I really wonder, though, whether part of the prejudice against philosophy or the tendency to call philosophy bullshit is because it's not exactly clear what it does, much like poetry in a way. And, there's this old chestnut that people repeat often, philosophy bakes no bread.
I've never heard that one before.
Oh, it's a quote from the poet Novalis. Philosophy bakes no bread. Clearly people repeat that, meaning philosophy doesn't actually do anything. But they leave out the other part of the quote, which is philosophy bakes no bread, but she can procure for us God, freedom, immortality, right? So, I think that it does do something, but it does something in a way that's not immediately understandable to us, as comparable to the way that other things do things.
Okay, so I'm going to press this. I don't like the expression devil's advocate because I always wonder why the devil needs so many advocates. But I'm going to press this a little bit. I bet if you asked an accountant what it was they were doing and what it is to be an accountant, they could give you an answer.
Yeah.
So with a historian or a physicist or all these different things that are well defined, so you go to a philosopher and you say, look, Elon Musk sends you a thing where you have to actually send an email justifying your job as a philosopher, explaining what it is that you do. And it turns out we can't even really specify anything. Isn't that sad? If we can't give an answer to the question what it is we're actually doing, other than thinking really hard, which is, as I say, too broad, are we doing anything really specific? What's the difference between poetry and philosophy? Reading scripture and philosophy? Being a quantum physicist and philosophy? What is it that makes philosophy philosophy?
But isn't the great irony here that asking the question, what is it, is itself doing philosophy?
Right.
But I wonder, is that such an irony? Because as Talia said, biologists don't often ask the question, what is biology? And, accountants don't often ask the question, what is accounting? But the moment someone asks, what is biology? I think we would say they're doing the philosophy of biology. That is, they've crossed into a different disciplinary ballgame.
Right. And that's a different question than what do you do? I think Talia is right that probably if Elon Musk sent me an email, first of all, Elon, send me an email, please.
Drop us a line. We want to know what you think.
I'm waiting. I have a very long response email to you. But at any rate, if Elon Musk sent me an email that was like, what is it that you do? I could tell him what I do, but that's not the same thing as saying, what is philosophy?
Correct.
In the same way that a biologist or an accountant or a physician can tell me what they do, but that's not the same thing as to say, what is biology? What is accounting? What is medicine? Or what is healthcare? I think this kind of gets back to the question that you were noting earlier. At least one of the threats to philosophy, or one of the reasons that people tend to say philosophy is just bullshit, is that there's a kind of anti-intellectualism, right? Like, we don't really know what this is. Let's just say that it's navel gazing. But I don't actually think that philosophy's biggest existential threat is anti-intellectualism. I think it's actually credentialism.
Yeah.
I agree.
That we've turned curiosity into this gated community with tenure track guards and demanded that it explain itself in the way that every other discipline of work or discipline of inquiry operate. And it's not like every other discipline of work or inquiry.
I agree with that. And I do think that that's a problem right now. And I think that it's leading to really bad philosophy, really surface philosophy, particularly the pressure to publish so much, even in grad school.
Yeah.
I mean, I look back to what I was doing in grad school and where I was, and I realize now I'd be a complete failure as a grad. I just wouldn't make it. I couldn't cut it. I couldn't publish that much or write that much. But furthermore, I would say that students at that point, they're not fully cooked yet. So there's this pressure to generate stuff and get it out there. And so you're generating stuff and you're getting it out there. And then there's this expectation that we engage with the literature. But if the literature is based on confusion, cranking stuff out, we get cottage industries, we get philosophical problems and literatures that are just really based on rust stuff.
Yeah.
Then the source of our confusion may not be that the issue itself is confusing, but rather it's based on nothing. I mean, look at conversational drift. People start talking about one concept like at a bar, right? You're talking about one thing, and next thing you know, you're talking about another. And that's fine at a bar, but in terms of a discipline, these concepts shift and these issues shift. And before too long, we don't even know what we're talking about. So someone can come in and say, look, you're just making up your own confusion. You say that philosophy is perplexing, but that's just because you've perplexed yourself.
Yeah.
The reason that you can't answer the question, what is philosophy, or philosophy becomes a philosophical question, is because there's nothing really answering to the term.
I want to link that up with Lee's position about the threat to philosophy being credentialism. When I first came to DePaul, I was the chair of the committee of our liberal studies program. So that's what other places call their core curriculum. Almost every university has one of these required courses that all students have to take. And one of the divisions was called philosophical inquiry. And I was the chair of the committee that oversaw that, which meant we approved classes to be in the domain and so on. And we used to have to submit every year assessment reports.
I hate those.
And what we would assess were the learning outcomes that we expected of students taking classes in the philosophical inquiry learning domain. So my committee, mostly people from the philosophy department, someone from education, and someone from the business school, all of them, even the person from the business school, refused the entire notion of a learning outcome. I said, okay, I can go to the main oversight committee, but they're going to say, no, this is impossible. And so they then decided that I must go to the oversight committee and tell them we have only one learning outcome, and that is I now better understand the meaning of life. So I told this to the committee, and the guy is like, well, Rick, that's so stupid because
it's not measurable.
No, what he said was, you assume there is one meaning of one life. And I looked at him and I said, Charles, you now better understand the meaning of life.
I mean, one thing I want to say about assessment reports, and maybe I should have saved this for a future Barstool confession, but in my view, assessment reports are philosophy. That's quite literally part of what we do in philosophy. I think to say that assessment reports always have to have an outcome is to misunderstand what assessment is. So that's one thing. But I think this actually ties back to what Talia was saying earlier about the fact that part of the way that philosophy has been professionalized, credentialized, is that it becomes kind of complicit in its own confusion, right? Like the real question is not whether philosophy has to be obscure or profound in order to be philosophy, but why is it that people increasingly feel like they have to talk in riddles or publish incomplete thoughts in order to do philosophy?
No, I hear you on that. But I have to say, I want to herd us back to what I take to be the question. Because regardless of the professional pressures, this is a philosophical question. What is philosophy?
Yeah.
Right.
But I thought the question was, is philosophy bullshit? And I think what we're assessing is, why is it the case that philosophy sounds like bullshit?
Maybe because it is. Okay, so one of the proudest days of my life was back in the day. I was offered the opportunity to present at this HIV data summit. And I was like, oh my God, a data summit. And you invited a philosopher. And it's not like I do XFi, I produce rigorous data. And generally speaking, philosophers don't do that. I mean, we do have XFi, but that's the exception that proves the rule. Or you have philosophy that is parasitic on the empirical sciences, philosophy of quantum or something like that. But we're not known for our research. So if we're not known for really collecting data, as I joked at that summit, I said, well, philosophers don't collect data. We just make shit up. But usually it's really good shit. It's not just like any old shit. It's excellent shit that you can use. But there's this question, that connects to, I think, the aspirations of philosophy to transcend, to, as it were, sit in an armchair, think really hard about stuff and magically come up with some deep truths or something like that. What is it that we think that we're doing? And are we doing anything? What are we delivering up?
I would agree with you that philosophy is pursuing truth, but it is also a philosophical question. What is truth? Mm-hmm. And so what becomes difficult is to tell someone, well, we look at what the truth is in all of these areas. What's the truth of life? What's the truth of sex? What's the truth of food? As you said in the introduction, Talia, we could do a philosophy of anything. But we also want to figure out what the truth of truth is. And so while we're pursuing the truth of X, the very notion of what counts as truth is up for grabs. I also quickly just want to explain for Dave that XFi that Talia is talking about is experimental philosophy.
I want to go back to this thing about outcomes, because what maybe sets philosophy apart from other disciplines is that it's not primarily focused on outcomes. And that's not to say that philosophy doesn't produce outcomes. I mean, people go to war over ideas, right? So if it's bullshit, it's dangerous bullshit. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that we can say about philosophy is that it's a protest against the demand to produce quick, monetizable, I'll put in parentheses, knowledge, or quick monetizable outcomes.
I wonder, is there a difference between the question, is philosophy making shit up on the one hand? Sorry, Lee, there's going to be two hands here. And on the other, the question, does anything go in philosophy? Like once you say I'm doing philosophy, could you do whatever the hell you want? Why isn't drawing a picture philosophy? Why isn't playing a recorder philosophy? And I think those are two different forms of BS. We're not talking about anything. That's one form of BS. And we can do whatever the hell we want. That's another form of BS. I might say, if it's raining, then I'm going to get wet. And then I say, oh, okay, from that, it follows that I'm the Queen of France. I think that's a different form of bullshit.
I like that. And that's a really good distinction, Rick. Not knowing or not being able to provide a decent answer to the question, what is philosophy? Could be one source of the worry that is bullshit, but a different worry and a different kind of way in which philosophy could be bullshit is if you thought, well, look, anything at all could just simply be philosophy.
Right.
Am I philosophizing right now? Or if I go make myself some pasta or a sandwich, is that philosophizing? Where do we draw the line?
I think pasta, yes. Sandwich, no.
What do you have against sandwiches? And what if I put pasta in my sandwich?
Oh, that's that postmodern philosophy.
Hey there, listeners, it's Lee. If you've been listening for a while, congratulations on your excellent taste. But if you're a new listener, let me be the first to tell you that Hotel Bar Sessions isn't just a podcast. It's a whole community, and we want you to be a part of it. Here's how. Bookmark our website at www.hotelbarpodcast.com. That's where you'll find past episodes, show notes, news and updates, and probably all the things that are going to get us reported to the current administration's ideology police. If that doesn't scare you, and it probably should, we're on Blue Sky, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. Just search for Hotel Bar Sessions Podcast and you'll find us. And honestly, we need you there. Otherwise, it's just the three of us here yelling into the void every week, and trust me, we do that enough already. Following us on social media is easy, free, and scientifically proven to make you hotter, smarter, and better at small talk. Okay, scientifically proven might be a stretch, but you get the point. So here's the bottom line. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, hell, tell your bartender about Hotel Bar Sessions Podcast. This conversation's way too good to keep to yourself. All right, the break's almost over, but seriously, follow us, fight us, flirt with us, just don't forget about us. And now back to the conversation.
So here are a couple of examples of philosophers who have actually told us what philosophy is, or tried to anyway. Fairly recently, Graham Priest argued that philosophy is a form of critique, so it's primarily negative. It takes aim at leading social beliefs and mores, other philosophical theories and arguments. It takes aim at anything. And he thinks that what really characterizes it is that it's unfettered critique. That is, anything is up for grabs. You know, if you're in a particular science, there are certain things that you cannot ask, not acceptable. There are starting points that you need. If you're doing history, for example, the fact that time exists or that history occurs is not going to be the sort of question that you can ask. That's going to be out of bounds. So the thought then is that philosophy is unfettered. It is, as it were, absolute. What's interesting, though, is that it's primarily negative. It's not really something that gives us something positive. I mean, he does think that there are positive theories and positive philosophical views. But what makes those philosophical views powerful is precisely their ability to enable a critique. The positive view ends up, as it were, being the cart, right, that is following the horse being critique.
When we think about this kind of contrast, like Priest saying, look, philosophy is critique, compared to someone else like French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, who's going to say that it's concept creation, I think that's a false binary. I mean, I think we only create new concepts because we've already broken the old ones. I'm struck by how often philosophy is imagined as either a wrecking ball or a sculpture studio, because it's really quite different than both of those and a combination of both of those. I mean, it's much more like, as I like to tell my students, composting, breaking stuff down to fertilize something else.
I get the breaking things down, but I'm not sure what it is that philosophy is fertilizing.
Here we go back to the fertilizer.
What's growing from that shit?
New concepts.
This idea that first we break it down and then we build. I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think that sometimes you can't make a critique until you have the new idea. You can't even see the critique until the new idea is already there. If you think about Kant's response to Hume causation, you can't make the critique, for example, that Hume confounds the analytic with the a priori or something like that until you have the tremendous concept of the synthetic a priori. So you need the concept first to launch the criticism.
I mean, I totally take that friendly amendment. I was just trying to point out that it's a false binary to say that philosophy is either negative or positive. You know, like whether the creation comes before the critique or the opposite seems to just reinforce that point.
And I think we always need to keep in mind that Lee does not like two-handed philosophy.
It's not entirely true. Only when Rick does it.
But can I just say, I also reject the binary along with Lee and Talia I think that what both sides do, the critique side as negative and the constructive creative side, I think they both bring something to understanding or bring it to a way of grasping. That is, I think all of this is about understanding. And one thing critique does is it takes something that appears to us as a whole, that we think we know what it is and it makes sense and so on, and it breaks it up into parts and it says, wait a second, this is not really what we thought it was. This doesn't work the way we thought it did. Mm-hmm. And then if I take Gilles Deleuze's notion that philosophy is the creation of concepts, that's not just making shit up, but we're creating concepts in order to try to think something that otherwise wouldn't be thinkable. Another example he gives, and we've talked about this issue on the podcast, is Descartes' cogito, that is the I think. Mm-hmm. That's a concept. And now I really like what you said, Talia, that allows Descartes to then also critique other things that came before that he couldn't critique without that concept. And so there is no real binary here, but I also think that construction can be critical and critique can be constructive.
I mean, one of the problems, though, is you have these beautiful definitions from Proust or Deleuze. One emphasizes the negative and one emphasizes the positive.
Right.
Deleuze says it's creation of concepts, of philosophical concepts. Priest is going to say, well, it's unfettered critique. Now, do we accept those together? And do we say it's a little bit of both? So are we going to go for like a Deleuzian, Preistian kind of hybrid? They're equally fundamental, because I think you can allow for both operating together as a question of the fundamentality that is bestowed upon one or the other. In Priest, it ends up being the critique, the negative part that's more important. In the Deleuze is the creative aspect, the positive generation of concepts that is really doing the work. And I don't know. I mean, I don't like the binary either, but I do find myself pulled towards the positive. You want philosophy to be doing something that is bringing something there that wasn't there before. And I'm not a Deleuze scholar. I can barely understand him. I have a colleague who helps me out. He holds my hand and walks me through it. And I bless him for it. But, really bringing about new ways of thinking that could never have been thought before. Can't remember which of you really put it that way. And it really, really hit me as powerful. It may be the case that philosophy is possibly unique in that if we could get a little bit more clarity in what it means to really bring about new ways of thinking.
I'm not sure that philosophy is anything in particular, and that might be the point. Mm-hmm. It isn't just a method or a tradition or a canon, and it definitely is not primarily about its outcomes, whether negative or positive, whether in the form of critique or in the form of new concepts. I think it is a process, and it's a process that happens in a scene. And this I'm borrowing from our previous co-host, Vanya Havis, who really made me think a lot more about the dramatic scene in which philosophy takes place. Mm-hmm. And, I've said many times on this podcast before that when people ask me to describe good music, I say it's just 3 chords and a sad story.
That's awesome.
If I was going to describe philosophy, I think the way I would describe the scene in which it takes place and the action that's happening in that scene as something like a good drink, a hard question, and at least 2 people committed to refusing to let a conversation die.
I like that because it goes back to the roots of philosophy in the West, at least as we tell the story in Socrates, because we don't know almost anything at all about Socrates. But what we seem to know about Socrates is that he annoyed the citizens of Athens by asking questions all the time.
Exactly.
And these questions, he seems to have thought were fundamental to something. And I think, and maybe here I've been overly influenced or maybe just enough influenced by the philosopher Pierre Hadot, who argues that in Greece, philosophy was a form of life. If you wanted to study with Plato, or if you wanted to study with a Stoic or Epicurus, rather than ask you about what you know, they would ask you questions about who are you? What kind of life do you live? What is your ethos? What are your values? And one thing that I think philosophy is about, and I think this is why we do a podcast rather than simply write articles and books and so on,
right,
is for me, I would say it's a way of asking questions all in the pursuit of something like living well and living well together.
I really like that.
I do too, because I think it's less about truth with a capital T and more about, as I said before, resisting closure to the conversation about it.
Right.
Staying in the question. And that, of course, means it's messy. It's frustrating. It's hard to define. But it's also the space where real thinking happens. The only space, I think, where you can demonstrate a true love of wisdom.
I don't know if it's the only space.
Right.
But one of the things I like about it is because it emphasizes the importance of the ethical and the political and the social.
Right.
So that makes me happy.
All right. I'm a metaphysician.
I'm sorry for you.
And this has come out in other topics we've discussed on the podcast. I'm a metaphysician precisely because I think at bottom there is social and political thinking going on already there.
Agreed.
And I want to resist the notion that metaphysics settles questions and then later on, once those are settled, we can get to epistemology and then ethics and then politics. I want to say it's normative all the way down.
I agree with that. It makes you not a very good metaphysician, I think, traditionally construed, right? It kind of makes you an anti-metaphysician in some sense. But you're doing the good work, Rick.
You're getting at kind of what I was trying to capture, which is that part of what philosophy is to refuse to let inherited meanings settle, right? Like it is about keeping questions open, even when Elon Musk sends you an email and demands a resolution of that question, right? Like by reporting what it is that you actually do. It's in that space where we stop taking things for granted, that we ask, how do we get here? What are we missing? Who's being left out? Who's not being heard? You know, it's uncomfortable, it's unfinished, but it's necessary. And this is my olive branch to Rick. I know I've made fun of metaphysics a lot, but I think I've learned a lot from Rick in exactly this way, that I have a tendency to think of metaphysics as being this kind of settled canon. And when you refuse to let it be settled, that seems to me to be where the most interesting philosophy happens.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting metaphysics that can be done, certainly in the area of like social ontology and things like that.
Absolutely,
that are sort of coming out.
Exactly.
But I think that really requires looking at metaphysics in a possibly very different way.
Sure.
You know, I'm fine with it. It's sort of like, yeah, I'm going to go with causation after all, but it's Humean causation.
Right.
So the metaphysics you get at the end of the day is very different.
Yeah. But I mean, that's one of the things I also appreciate about philosophy is that it, as a critique, is always also self-critical. When I say I'm a metaphysician, if I'm a good one, that also should involve the critique of metaphysics.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I feel like a broken clock here, but I don't think that philosophy's job is to necessarily give answers. Often it's really to just reframe the urgency
Right.
of a particular question. I mean, just think about how many times we've re-asked the same question. What is justice? What is a person? What is the good life? We call perennial philosophical questions perennial because they never get settled. They just get reframed in different modes of urgency. I mean, I think that if you walk away from a philosophy class feeling more confident about your beliefs, something went wrong. Walking away from a philosophy class should feel a lot more like, you know, when you have too many tabs open on your browser and the whole thing freezes. Like that's what
I agree.
Adorno describes this as vertigo. Philosophy should give you vertigo.
In a sense, recognizing that certain things we take for granted are contingent. Already that's enough to make you a little bit dizzy, feeling like falling. One of the questions I was going to ask Lee, I mean, there is this sense in which in philosophy we think about the perennial questions, but I mean, I also think it's interesting to think about like, how do new questions arise in philosophy? Because I do think that we do have new venues worth pursuing.
Exactly.
Where the question isn't necessarily perennial. And so how is it that philosophy can take on that kind of newness where we can have questions appear that weren't there before?
I mean, I think there are a couple of ways. One is, as I said before, through a kind of composting process, right? We've broken down old things and we found that new plants have grown, new ideas have grown. I don't think that that's always the case. I do think that a lot of times new things happen in the world, new things appear in the world, and we have to generate concepts out of our experience or generate new questions out of our experience. That is equally as important, But I don't think that new concepts are ex nihilo.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in this direction, we also need to acknowledge something that we haven't really talked about till this point, because already at the beginning, Talia confessed to being philosophically promiscuous. And then we all have been talking about how we don't want philosophy to be definitely this or that. But I don't want to give the impression that all our colleagues in the discipline of philosophy within universities are happily going along saying, you know what, I don't much care what philosophy is. I can't tell you, especially on search committees, how many times we have to confront someone saying, yeah, but I just don't think they're doing philosophy.
Exactly right.
And those challenges, not the person saying, I don't think that's philosophy, but on the other side, the one challenging what philosophy is, that's a really important way in which new questions come to light.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point because there are a subset of people in the profession of philosophy that can ask the question, what is philosophy?
Right.
But there are a lot of people who, if they ask that question, far more if they make the claim X is not philosophy, who basically get evicted.
Right.
Search committees are like these weird enforcers of HOA rules of a gated community, right? Like about what gets to count as legitimate philosophy and who gets to count as a legitimate philosopher.
Right.
And it's always ad hoc, because if you go back to the problem of defining philosophy, it's always going to be a je ne sais quoi. I know philosophy when I see it.
I think that was pornography.
Pornography, philosophy, we're drawing those analogies. Like I said, I'm philosophically promiscuous, and it's for a reason. If you're going to justify an exclusion, or if you're going to justify saying this is not philosophy, you're going to make something up after the fact, but it's not really getting at what's going on there. I mean, on the one hand, to go back to an earlier point that Rick made, it does seem we want to acknowledge just simply making a sandwich by itself doesn't count as philosophy. Perhaps within some kind of context, if we could spin this out, maybe it could. I don't know. But all things being equal, no, it's not. So there's got to be something that is philosophy and something that isn't philosophy. Some things just don't count as philosophy. That seems right.
It seems right to me too. And I want to go back to something that you used in setting up that point, which is there has to be some kind of a justification of why this is philosophy or why this is not philosophy. And maybe it's ad hoc, maybe it's ex post facto. But I do think that one of the important things that we've left out of this conversation so far is that it does seem like philosophy, as Rick often says, happens in the space of giving reasons.
Right.
And judging, assessing, I would say, whether or not those reasons are good reasons or bad reasons. And of course, we have a whole tradition, we have a canon, we have multiple canons that we use to justify whether or not claim X should be accepted by other people, should be accepted as philosophy or whatever.
But does that request for justification or legitimation put an undue burden on those who are already marginalized, who are trying to do philosophy that is new? Because you're going to be on your heels trying to justify that what you're doing is philosophy. Whereas traditional metaphysics say, like if I'm doing Mariology, it's like, oh, that's obviously philosophy. But if I'm doing something entirely different, and it's like, well, how does that count as philosophy? Now I give an answer, right? Have I bought into something that is already problematic? I mean, that's what I think Christy Dodson is getting at.
I think that it puts an undue burden on philosophers who are doing something new if we stipulate that the only people, the only judges or the final judges of whether or not a justification is, as you said, legitimate, whether a justification is justified, are the people already in power. I don't think that it is the case that people who are doing new kinds of philosophy aren't also justifying that their philosophy is philosophy. I just think that they're justifying it in different ways. And that obviously is the space where philosophical conversations happen. I'm giving reasons for why this is important, why this should be considered, or why this should be considered in a different kind of way. So it ought to be the case that the burden is on everyone equally.
But it's not, right? Because if someone takes up metaphysics,
it's not.
So it's just assumed to be, there's no requirement of any kind of explanation for why you're doing what you're doing. It's just obviously philosophy.
But I think that's descriptively true. It's not prescriptively true. It doesn't have to be that way. It ought not be that way. But it is the case that it is that way. And why it's that way is a philosophical question. I think it's a philosophical question that often gets counted as not philosophy.
Hey, Hotel Bar Sessions listener, it's Rick. I'm so happy to meet a lot of you out there in the world, and often you ask me, why did I decide to get into podcasting? And I answer, I did it for the money. The only thing is, I didn't know I'd be the one paying the money. I am so grateful to all of you Patreon supporters who support the podcast, and I wish those of you who didn't would consider joining us as well. Go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions, and there you could subscribe at many different levels. Choose whatever level is most comfortable for you. If you'd prefer to do a one-time donation, go to our website at hotelbarpodcast.com, and there you'll find a donations page where you can give us a one-time donation at any level you feel comfortable. Thanks for your support.
I just want to return briefly to Dotson's argument about, is that really philosophy? So this is Christy Dotson. We'll put a link to her very famous essay on this topic in the show notes. You know, she talks about the culture of justification, of justifying what is and what isn't philosophy, who is and who isn't a philosopher. And that really hits hard because, as I often say to my students when I assign this essay in my classes, if philosophy departments were like airports, a lot of us would get stopped at the gate because our papers don't look right. It's not always what you're doing, but who you are while doing it. And I don't want us to go too quickly over that point because I think it's a hugely central point to like how it is that what is philosophy gets answered today.
I share your worry that often when someone is thinking about what philosophy is, they're trying to answer the question, is this philosophy? And they're trying to answer that question in order to say no.
Yeah, that's right.
You find very few people asking the question, well, is this philosophy? Saying, I hope I could answer yes. I hope this counts as philosophy.
So true.
And what's interesting for me is that I feel like I have a sense of what philosophy is, and I have no interest in policing the boundaries of it.
One of the things that I really like in the Dodson piece is this whole idea that in answering the question, what is philosophy, there's this presumption of norms that are universally held and relevant across the board, such that you're going to get this fixed answer, this agreement that we all know about and we all share. And within that context, questions like, but how is this philosophy can even arise?
Right.
Because you started that way. And I really like her use of the philosopher Gail Solomon, who practices queer philosophy and this real resistance to homogeny, uniformity, and this real emphasis on the proliferation of newness and kind of spinning out. It's not going to be something that you can easily fit inside a box. This thought that there are these universally shared, univocally relevant norms that constitute what philosophy is.
Exactly right.
You know, once you've given up that assumption, though, it really puts you in a kind of giddy, I think, exciting position about, like, if one were to answer the question without making those presumptions, what does that look like? I mean, you can't even really give one answer, can you?
Of course you can't. Talia, I love this point because I think what you're pointing to is one really unique aspect to the discipline of philosophy, which is not only does it not rely on consensus, it actually needs for there not to be consensus.
Right.
Right. If we all started agreeing with each other, we'd be out of business.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, and that's something that we've had to be adamant about here on the podcast, that for us, disagreement or argument, as we sometimes put it, is a tool of our trade. Just the way a scalpel is a doctor's tool, we use disagreement and we use argument as one of our tools. If you take one of the greatest tools I have away from me, I'm not going to be doing really good philosophy.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of synonyms for argument there. I mean, justification is one, assessment is one, explanation is one. I mean, all of these things happen in the course of making an argument, not arguing like siblings argue, but making an argument like an attorney makes an argument before a court. And I think that one of the things that people often misunderstand about philosophical arguments is that it is in the argument that the philosophy is being done.
But what about cases in which, as a philosopher, you don't give an argument?
Give me an example of one.
Well, consider Nietzsche. I don't think that Nietzsche gives a lot of arguments, or if Nietzsche does give arguments, they're not common ones, and they're kind of going to be arguments that are hard to take seriously, at least at first blush. If you look at some of this stuff, it's just written in an aphoristic way.
Yeah, I mean, I might disagree that those don't involve arguments or can't be explained as arguments, but I get your point.
I mean, I think it's true that most of the time we do rely on argumentation, but I'm worried about insisting upon that because I think that sometimes there's not an argument in the same kind of obvious sense.
But there is an assessment, an explanation, an evaluation. All of these are synonyms for argument. You know, we have this logical rigor requirement attached to the word argument, but often a case is stated in an observation, in an aphorism, in poetic language. I don't think that those aren't philosophical arguments.
It becomes a little bit attenuated at that point, right?
Yeah,
It becomes a little bit more difficult to say what we're talking about when we talk about these arguments or justifications or legitimations, and how that is different from simply asserting something.
Yeah.
But here I agree with Lee. Nietzsche might not present what would in other contexts be considered an argument. But when I'm teaching Nietzsche, what I end up doing is supplying for students arguments based on his text for what he's saying. In other words, Nietzsche can get away with that in ways that I can't in order to bring students to understanding about why Nietzsche doesn't give argument. The similar thing could be said of a philosopher like Adorno, but still, I think when Lee said, yeah, but there's giving reasons and justifications and support, I would use a much larger word like evidence, which is also part of argumentation. Then I think Nietzsche has arguments in this broad sense.
Part of what we try to do in philosophical education is to give students the tools that they need in order to find the argument, to find the assessment, to find the evaluation in what might not immediately present itself to me as an argument. Is there no argument in, say, the parable of the prodigal son?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's clearly an argument there, right? It's not presented as an argument. It's presented as a parable with implied assessments, evaluations, definitions, etc. But part of philosophical training is being able to pull out from that some meaning that could be given as a reason in a philosophical argument.
In some sense, I'm going completely against my training, and I just want to press on this a little bit because, hey, disagreement.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, that's the way that I typically do philosophy, right? Reasons, arguments. But I'm worried, as I say, to go back to my concern earlier with Lee, that once you start going, well, it doesn't need to be like a logical argument. Well, it doesn't really need to be this or that. It can be, Socrates is wrong because he's ugly, whatever. I mean, once you start going there, it becomes so thin that I lost my ability to understand what it is exactly that we're talking about. If we are talking about something, we need to be a little bit sharper about it rather than using argument as a metaphor, because I would say the metaphor starts to wear thin.
I think the metaphor starts to become more elastic. I don't think that it starts to wear thin, because I think that at the end of the day, ultimately what we're doing is meaning making. Going back to our earlier discussion, maybe that's in the negative sense of critique. Maybe that's in the positive sense of concept creation. Maybe that's just in a evaluative sense or a descriptive sense, but ultimately what we're doing in philosophy is meaning making. And I'm using, you're right, argument as an extremely elastic term here to, cover all of those things. It's not that I don't hear your objection. I just think, I hope that it doesn't actually undermine the point I was trying to make about what I think is going on when we're doing philosophy.
Who let the Tsar out? Who?
Y'all are both fired. Thanks, listeners. We're going to be closing up the bar now. These two jokers are shit-faced.
I'm not. I was drinking virgins all the way through.
You have no excuse then.
No, I'm just this way.
Okay, let me put something out here. As succinctly and as directly as you can answer this, what is philosophy? Rick, I'll go to you first.
I think philosophy is an inquiry into what it means to live well and live well together.
Mic drop. Well done.
Talia?
I introduced this topic and I really was not expecting to be tested on it or to be forced to give an answer to this question, especially after having said that there are many answers to it. But I do think that the idea of illumination and orientation is a really important function of philosophy. I mean illumination or orientation to life, to living one's life in ways in which one is faced with the rocky questions. And here I do wax a little bit existential now that we have let the Sartre out.
Ooh.
Okay, now you're fired.
Look, the only one we need for this to go on is the bartender, and she's about to fire all of us.
That's a fact.
But you were going to wax existential.
Yeah, because I do really think that depth is not always important to philosophy, but it's a key characteristic of it. So I think that the illumination or orientation needs to have a kind of depth to it. And for me, it's about jumping out in a way that, if not gets us into the spiritual, because that takes a religious slant on it, at least requires that we jump out into the existential, so that we're looking at our lives and existence in a way that is a little bit skewed, a little bit scary, a little bit at risk. And I think that it's in that place that you're going to find the depth of illumination that is characteristic of philosophy. I know this is not a very good definition, but perhaps it points towards where I'm thinking a lot of important stuff that we call philosophy happens.
I think it's fair that none of us have really good definitions. And I think that, saying the definition that I'm giving is gesturing towards what I mean without saying it's hand waving is fine. But if you were going to ask me, as I said before, I think that philosophy is really, at the end of the day, a hard question. And at least two people who have a commitment to not letting the conversation die. I really honestly do think that that is at its core what philosophy is. Now, I will say, I also think there are qualities to that conversation. I would include a certain kind of rigor. I would include a certain kind of social and political awareness and historical awareness. I would include attentiveness to one's precarity and the precarity of others, all of those sorts of things. But I might also say that all of those additional qualities of the conversation that I prefer might be matters of taste. And I think that philosophy is, in many cases, a matter of taste, or what counts as philosophy for anyone is in many cases a matter of taste.
Do I have to give reasons for a matter of taste?
No, that's actually a good point. I suppose if I say I like bourbon and not gin.
And you say why? And it's because I do.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe I don't have to give reasons for those matters of taste, but they are my flavor of philosophy.
But judgments surrounding taste, one ought to be able to give reasons for. In other words, if I don't like mushrooms and someone asks me why, the answer is because I don't. But if I say mushrooms ought not be eaten, mushrooms are bad, or mushrooms are ugly.
Or people who eat mushrooms should not be given the right to vote.
Yeah.
I love mushrooms, and I'm finding myself really feeling marginalized right now. And I think that it's a very poor way to welcome me onto the program by dissing mushrooms.
I'm sorry,
So
maybe
the both of you really, no, it's not okay.
we should have talked about this in the pre-podcast interviews, but
Put that on our application form for the next co-host.
I'm okay with mushroom lovers, but I can't tolerate mushrooms.
Well, I love mushrooms, Talia.
Okay, good. I hate mushrooms, but I'm okay with mushroom lovers. It's kind of like, hate the sin, love the sinner.
But Rick, I think that your point here was the right one, which is, giving reasons to one another. I might just say, look, that's just my taste. I think mushrooms are gross, or I think mushrooms are delicious. But if I make other judgments related to those matters of taste, as if my matters of taste are reasons themselves for making an argument, yeah, I completely agree with you.
I agree with that too.
Well, unfortunately, this is not a matter of taste, but our bartender is giving us last call.
Boo.
For which there needs to be no reason or argument given.
No, it's just simply a proclamation.
Get out of here.
Just an announcement.
Yeah.
Get the hell out of here. You guys, we're tired of your bullshit.
Exactly.
But Talia, this has been a great first conversation with you. I'm, again, really excited about having you on the podcast this season and looking forward to so many more conversations. And listeners, if you haven't already, please make sure that you're subscribed to Hotel Bar Sessions on whatever platform you listen to podcasts. Also, drop us a rating or a review if you happen to be on one of those platforms that allow for ratings or reviews. And yeah, you guys, I guess we'll catch you next time.
Good night.
Good night.